In my role as an emergency vet, I attend a lot of euthanasias, and I would say at least half the time people apologize to me for crying during the process, and I have to tell them it is appropriate to be sad when you're losing a family member. Like, that is, your response is normal, and it seems like there's a lot of shame and a lot of embarrassment about the feelings that they feel at that time.
I'm Kevin Lee, President and CEO of Mid-America Transplant, and we are honored to sponsor this episode of Grief is Real, Big, Better Shared. At Mid-America Transplant, we have the privilege of working with families across southern Missouri and northeast Arkansas who make the heroic decision to donate their loved ones' organs or tissues. While donation often brings families comfort, they are still heartbroken by their loss. We are driven by compassion for these families and continue to walk with them through their grief journey. Mid-America Transplant provides several programs to help families memorialize their loved one, but we believe that some of the best support can be provided by a grief center. We are proud to work with the Center for Good Grief and appreciate everything they are doing in the region to bring healing to people who are coping with loss. Mid-America Transplant is inspired by life and by the donor families who give transplant patients a second chance at life. For more information about being a donor, visit sayyesgivelife.org.
Hello, welcome to Grief is Real, Big, Better Shared, the podcast everyone needs to hear but nobody wants to hear. I'm Angela Hamblin-Kelly, the administrator of the Baptist Centers for Good Grief. I think it's important to pause for a minute and remember who we are at the Baptist Centers for Good Grief. We started Camp Good Grief in 1999. This was the first grief camp in the Mid-South. We grew to include other programming and finally the first comprehensive grief center in the Mid-South. So for 26 years, we have been providing grief camps, grief groups, and individual grief counseling for children, teens, and adults from our 3 different locations. We are doing this podcast because clients have been asking for it as a platform for support. That is really the foundation of most of our services, the community asking for more. We are so grateful to our community donors who have generously supported us over the years, as all of our services are free of charge. Again, this podcast was started because grief is the most universal experience there is. Again, this is the podcast everyone needs to hear because grief involves pain and vulnerability, which is also why this is the podcast nobody wants to hear. I sit here as a grief counselor, but I'm also a griever. I've lost my dad, my brother, my nephew, and several other beloved family members along the way. But I also have specific training in grief counseling, and that's what we want this podcast to be, a place where we can honestly look at grief and discuss the heart and head tug of war from an evidence-based grief counseling perspective, but also a very real-life perspective too. Today, I'm joined by a very dear friend and an incredible supporter of the Baptist Centers for Good Grief and Camp Good Grief, Dr. Amy Walsh. Amy, thanks so much for being here today.
Thanks for having me.
Dr. Amy practices emergency and critical care medicine at Memphis Veterinary Specialist and Emergency, and we are so thankful that you're here. I asked Amy to be on this podcast because of just her gifts and talents that we see at Camp Good Grief and all the ways you help with our children's group and our teen groups at our grief centers. And that's just one area of Dr. Amy's life. And then there's this other side of you and what you do in your career. And some people may be thinking, well, how is that all pertinent to this podcast? Well, this episode, we want to focus on pet loss. We know that pet loss is real. Like we say here, grief is real, big, and better shared. And that's the same with pet loss. It's different because at the Baptist Centers for Good Grief, our focus is working with people who are grieving the loss of another person. But we know loss is many things. Loss is many, many things outside of death. This is just our focus. And we also get a lot of calls from people who are grieving the death of a pet. And that grief needs attention too. It just, we have to find various ways, other resources to provide support because we're not able to do that, Monday through Friday within our centers. But it's important for us to have conversations when people do call. Maybe it's the first death a child has experienced. So we're going to talk about that some today. Or maybe the pet death is following the death of a spouse. We see that a lot too. And so pet loss is so important and significant. And we felt like it really deserved a conversation so that we can learn how to cope when we are grieving a pet loss. So, Amy, thank you so much for doing that here with us today. So let's just jump in and talk about our pets, why they're so important.
I mean, pets are part of the family. I think when I was younger, and I am nearing the age of 50, our family treated our pets a lot differently than my pets live in my home at this time.
Yes.
Our dogs were outside. They were fed. They weren't, dressed up in a sweater and taken in a wagon around the neighborhood. They weren't sleeping in the bed with us, but pets are family. A lot of people are choosing not to have children, and pets kind of fill a void and are treated very much as children. In a lot of cases. So they are very important to us. They are very beneficial to us. Mm-hmm. People who have pets are more likely to exercise and meet their daily exercise goals because they take their pets on walks. They're more likely to have lower blood pressure, especially if they have existing high blood pressure. There are a lot of benefits to having small creatures living in your homes and in your hearts. Yes. And I think that a lot of lives are greatly enriched, mine included, with pets around. So I can't imagine my life without at least a dog to boss me around. So
that's right. They are very good bosses. Mm-hmm. Yes. And like you said about the benefits of, the physical for the blood pressure, we also see people who struggle with depression or loneliness, or like I said, maybe they've had another loss, like a spouse or a roommate or a companion, and all of a sudden find themselves alone. A lot of people will look to, well, let me get a pet, or maybe this is an opportunity to have a pet so that they do have companionship. And so that's a huge loss when it's another loss of companionship. And I like how you talked about just how pets have changed since we were children and to now when we have pets. Our dogs growing up were outside dogs. Now my dog is not an outside dog and sits on the couch dog. And what do you mean I'm not getting in this bed dog? So yeah, I hadn't thought about that to just now, like how different that has become over time.
Yeah. I mean, I purchase cars
yes.
and like perform maintenance in my home with my dogs in mind. Mm-hmm. I installed a deck and put in ramps because at the time I had 2 fairly old dogs. Mm-hmm. Now I'm down to 1, but I knew that stairs were going to be a challenge, and so ramps instead of steps. These are things that I think of because I don't have children, and the pets are the babies.
Yeah, yeah, and you're right. The way that we look at our pets, people celebrate their pet's birthday or the gotcha day, and there might be a hat involved all the way to a banner and a cake or whatever.
I may have thrown birthday parties.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
I'm guilty of these things.
So our pets are part of our family. Mm-hmm. And so I think right there with grief, if you're grieving the death of a pet, is to acknowledge that it's significant, and that's hard in our culture because other people might look at you and say, well, that's not as bad as my loss. And right there, I'm just going to say that goes back to the rule of we never compare. We never, ever compare. You never know what someone's circumstances are. Just listen and be kind. But with the pet, we do have to acknowledge right there, especially if it's companionship, if that's who you're coming home to every day, and who's more loyal than coming home to your pet, who's so happy to see you and just waiting on you and wants to do whatever you want to do. And then for that to be gone, that's huge. So we have to acknowledge that is a loss.
Yeah, I mean, in my role as an emergency vet, I attend a lot of euthanasias, mm-hmm. And I would say at least half the time people apologize to me for crying during the process. And I have to tell them it is appropriate to be sad when you're losing a family member. Mm-hmm. Like that is, your response is normal. And it seems like there's a lot of shame and a lot of embarrassment about the feelings that they feel at that time.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and that's an important topic, euthanasia, and how the care of our pets is different than how we care for people. And that's going to go all the way to what we're going to talk about in a little bit about getting another dog. We can't get another grandpa. So there's a lot of differences, but anticipatory grief with pets is a real thing with people too, as dogs age, as we notice their hips and things, or they're having a harder time moving around, and then having those conversations with a vet, is it time, or how do I know when it's time, and then when it is time?
Yeah, it is. I am often delivering a very sad or terminal diagnosis, and multiple times a night when I work. And I have, families that choose not to go for definitive care and focus more on like a hospice or a palliative care route. I remind them, because this is something that I've struggled with, to be present and to not focus so much on what is coming, but celebrate the little moments that they have. And we talk about how to know when it's time, and that's different for every pet. But there are, things that they can look for in terms of quality of life and how their pet is changing over time that can give them some guidelines. It's such a difficult situation to be faced with that kind of information, to hear that your pet has something that will ultimately be the reason that their life ends. So it is helpful to be able to give them information, but it's a heavy conversation to have. And it's a lot of times people come in hoping that it's, a broken toenail or something that they ate. And it's a lot of bad news very quickly, because pets don't complain. They don't tell you what's happening. Right. A person would say, there's an ache in my right side when I turn. There's a heaviness, my heart's beating funny. And dogs want to chase the ball and bask in the sunshine. And often they don't let us in on the secret until it is very, very late in the game.
Yeah. And we can't tell them.
Yeah.
We can, but we want them to be able to understand, that this is what's happening, and these are why we're doing these things. And that's hard too, because with a person, you can verbally communicate like that and hope that they can understand.
You're going to have a rough week, but at the end, it's going to be okay.
Yes.
All dogs, dogs and cats are very much in the present. And I say dogs and cats because that is what those are the animals in my practice. Right. But cows and horses and goats and chickens too.
Right. Yes. And for me, not every animal is a dog. I have to remember that too. So we all have our love for sure. Well, I think too, so if we talk about when it's time for euthanasia, I'd love to talk about, because we get asked this question a lot, should we go? Should the children go? Should I tell the children in advance what's happening? And so I think that would be helpful to our listeners, is to kind of talk through that.
I think the answer is it depends.
That's right. That is the answer.
If it is too much for you to bear to watch that, know that the euthanasia process is quick and peaceful. And in general, people that work in veterinary clinics are kind and loving people, and your pet will be surrounded by love. Yeah. If you choose to be there, same thing. It's quick, it's peaceful, it doesn't hurt. And your vet can talk you through any things that might happen, because as a body passes, it doesn't look the same or behave the same as it did when it was alive. Some people choose to visit with their pet beforehand, skip the actual passing, and then maybe visit after. And all of that is okay. It's your experience, and you have to figure out what you want to remember and how you want to be present in that moment, and also what is healthy for you.
Yeah.
So, and the same is true of children. I think it's very difficult for very young kids to be there, because they truly don't understand what's happening. Death is difficult for them to understand. It's impermanent. It's like Chicago. It's hard to get there. Sometimes you don't come back.
Right.
And, older kids, definitely get it, but it can be very difficult. And it can sometimes be distracting for a parent who's very invested in the life of that pet to also have to, attend to their children's needs if they're having a Cat 5 come apart too.
That's right.
So, yeah, these are sometimes not decisions that can be premeditated.
That's right.
Sometimes you have to make them on the fly and do the
Right.
best with what you got. But if it's something that you are planning and you can do it on a kind of a scheduled basis, these are definitely things to consider and, figure out, is it best for me to do this while the kids are at school, have my moment, and then tell everybody the sad news? Or is this going to be a family thing and we're going to try to do it in our home because that's an option available in our area?
Right, right. So a couple of things that come to mind just from my own life experience. So we had the most beautiful Irish setter named Rascal, who I just loved and adored, and Rascal was not doing well. And I think I look back and I think, gosh, my parents were pretty remarkable and I think pretty progressive too, because Rascal all of a sudden had prostate cancer. And my parents sat us, my brother and I, down at the table one night and we're going to talk about options of care. And I remember chemo was an option and I guess radiation, but it was in Nashville like 4 times a week. And they're telling us this information and really giving us the choice, and talking about more of the hospice and palliative care options too. I mean, I think I was 10 years old. I had no idea I was going into this field. But I remember thinking, well, why would we do that? Rascal doesn't want to ride in the car that many days and he'll be so upset. And I also think my parents were crazy for giving it, because what if we had selected that option, but maybe they knew we weren't, I don't know. But I remember talking through that. But then Saturday morning when my dad took Rascal to the vet and just sort of said, I don't know if Rascal's coming back. So you all need to spend time with Rascal. And so in that moment, that's what we did. My parents made sure that we had spent time with Rascal that morning. I think my brother had gone to a game or work or something, and he was older. And I remember sitting in the den and waiting. And I heard the car and I heard my dad come in the house, but I didn't hear Rascal. And my dad went straight to the coffee pot. And literally, I'm like, well, but maybe I'm going to hear his, I was listening for his collar, right? For the little jingles. And then I heard my dad sniffle.
Oh.
And I can remember as a grown up now, I can be transported back to that child and my heart sinking. And I immediately got up and went to my room and shut the door because one, I had never seen my dad cry. My dad was a big hero, tough guy. And I was like, the world is over, Rascal's dead. And so that has stuck with me all these years of just how well my parents did in preparing us and having us a part of it. But then when it came, and I think for a lot of kids, this is their first time to maybe see an emotional response from parents or the first death in the family. And we will talk about that a little bit more, about just how to talk to them, to prepare them, the importance of it, how we're always as parents modeling behavior. And sometimes with the death of a pet, this is when we start modeling grief. And I'm sad and using that language and crying in front of children and knowing it's okay if they see us cry, those kinds of things. So I think that's very important. The other thing when we were talking about euthanasia is in our family, we had 2 pets die within months of an actual person dying. And so I think too, people have to take that into what is going on in the family. And I'm a grief counselor and I thought I had it all together. And I went and took one of our little dogs by myself after my dad died. And that was so a bad choice. I remember putting Ludi back in the car because she was a tiny dog. So we were burying her at home. And I'm like, I should not be doing this. Why am I doing this? But I did it and I made it. But it was not the right choice. I can look back now and think, I should have done that differently. The second death was my niece's dog after my brother died, her father, and we were all in the room together, and it was awful. And I was so proud of her as a teenager. She all of a sudden looked up and said, I don't want to be here. I can't do this. So she did the visiting, like you said before, and was able to verbalize what she needed. And I just remember in that moment being so proud of her to know. So you're right. A lot of this can't be planned in advance. You have to know your family. What are the other circumstances going on in the family, and doing as much prep work as you can, but then being very clear and direct when we come home if we have had to put our pet down.
Yeah. Clients sometimes ask me, what should I tell my kids? Should I say, the vet just couldn't save him. And I'm like, oh, let's not
right.
put the blame directly on me.
Right.
But like your 5-year-old will understand that it couldn't be fixed because they have toys that are broken and can't be repaired. And just tell them, be prepared for them to maybe ask a lot of questions that are maybe difficult to answer. But, think about that on the way home. Don't lie to them. Don't tell them. My parents might have told me that my hamsters ran away or my dog ran away or went to a farm.
Went to the farm.
and I think that was pretty common, for families back when I was a certain age. But I don't think that that's fair. So go into the farm is not always not the best answer, unless that is a true statement. Like if the dog actually did go to live on a farm, then that's great.
Right. But how many is that the truth?
Not often. Yeah.
Well, and I think too, talking to children, and so this goes back to so many other episodes that we have recorded about talking with children. Children can cope with what they know. They cannot cope with what they don't know. So we have to think, what is that age-appropriate specific language? But if the dog had cancer, then we talk about their cancer. If they were hit by a car, we talk about accidents. And we have to bring in that language, and instead of it's the vet's fault, that kind of thing, because then that can make us fear doctors and all those kinds of things. So going back to age-appropriate, what has happened, be real, be honest in those age-appropriate ways. And that's why people call us and are seeking help, and why we're here today talking about this, because it is hard in the moment when all of the emotions are stirred up to think clearly and rationally. And I think that goes to the emotions with pet loss that sometimes adults aren't prepared for and will hear, I just don't know why I'm taking this so hard. I don't know why I'm so upset.
It's just a dog.
It's just
a cat.
Yeah.
This is so silly. Yeah.
Yeah. And that goes back to what we were talking about in the beginning. It's not, just a fill in the blank. It's a family member. It's literally how many of us have just every day. I mean, sometimes cats may not be, they show it in their own way, but somebody who's just like, you're here and this is amazing and whatever you want to do is amazing and just, okay, great, we'll do this and that's amazing. I mean, how many of us have a family member that is that predictable of joy?
Oh, yeah. I mean, you can pretty much always count on my dog Funky to be a little happy when I come home. And when my partner comes home, his dearest human has arrived.
Right.
And that's all he wants is to play with him and be with him. And it is consistently just the biggest joy, the most special moment of Funky's day.
Yes.
Yeah.
My family tells me that, we don't think that our dog Buddy knows how to tell time, but at 5:30, he is by the back door and he is waiting. He is waiting for my car to come, and nights that I work late really throw him off, but he will not move. He stays out there until he knows she's coming home. She's coming home, and he's waiting with great joy. So I think the emotional response really surprises people. And I think that goes to just what we have believed culturally about it's just a pet. You can get another one, but really that's what we're here to talk about is that is not the case. With grief, it is all about the relationship. We grieve because we love. Yeah. Let's talk about after a pet dies, just kind of some of those immediate things we need to do or think about. Talking to children is one of those. And so, if they weren't there, then we do want to use that clear, direct language, and your vet can help with that. We can help with that in terms of using age-appropriate language, being honest about what has happened. But other things, just with even deciding, what do we do now? What do we do with the body?
Yeah. That's typically if you're doing euthanasia or if you're presenting your pet's remains to a veterinary clinic after they've passed at home, there's usually some decisions around that. There are some legalities around burying a body on your property. And you can do your own research on that. But there are options for both private and communal cremation available. And veterinary clinics can talk you through those options. You know, a lot of families choose to have the ashes returned in a special urn. But there are also some other options. I mean, you can have the ashes turned into memorials. Cremains can be turned into diamonds or into beautiful art glass. You know, you can bury them in your garden in the place that your pet liked to rest, so that something grows from that. So I think there's some beautiful ways to do that. Some families don't really have a use for the remains or a plan for that, or don't feel that they need that in their home, and they choose to do the communal cremation, and that's fine too. You can request, nose prints are my favorite. I love a good nose print, a paw print, something to hang on to. Those are things you can do ahead of time. There are kits available on the internet. You can make jewelry from your pet's nose. There are mess-free paw print kits, or you could even make some salt dough and or buy some air dry Sculpey and make some paw prints, you know, ahead of time at home. And how, you know, if you've got littles, you can have them decorate that. You can make as many as you want, and you know, have a paw print for everybody. But those are some nice ways to memorialize your pet. I always joke that I'm going to take some ashes from all of my girl cats and dogs that have passed and make myself a really lovely set of diamonds.
There you go. But that's so important, you know, thinking about what feels right, and not about what people are going to think about you, because that comes back to my rule of you don't have to tell anybody what you do, but it is important to think about what feels right to me, what is meaningful to me. Yeah. I know somebody who just really struggled with the communal, just did not want that, but also just like, I don't, you know, I've got 5 cats. I don't want eventually 5 urns in here. And so having something created, like a piece of glass, a decorative piece of glass that became like a sun catcher in her window, you know, that felt right to her. And so I think having a vet clinic that's just able to talk you through options like that is so important. And I just think too, there's so many lovely vets who do, you know, who will send you that nose print or paw print in the mail a couple of weeks later. That's just so meaningful to people to be able to keep that and have that. So
my sweet baby Muppet passed away almost 2 years ago, and I brought her to the place where I work. I hadn't planned on that because I am there enough. I really didn't want to have to work in the room where I had lost her. But we didn't have a choice. So it was 11 o'clock on a Friday night, so I had nowhere else to go. So they made nose prints and paw prints for me. And then the next shift I worked, somebody walked up to me right before I was going into the ICU and handed me a lock of her tail. And I lost my marbles.
Of course.
But that is something that I treasure. Yeah. So her tail, I had always dyed it. And there was still a little lingering pink in the hair that they gave me, but that was really special and something I hadn't thought to ask for, but the people there knew me well enough that I would want that.
And that goes to what you said earlier too, that most people in this field are so lovely. And, you know, you all are there because you want to fix and you want to heal. But you also are aware that sometimes that doesn't happen. And so you know that healing can be in another form too. So
sometimes the only medicine I have that will help is the drug that puts them to sleep.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So then there's also, you know, within our culture with people, there's memorialization is critical no matter if we're grieving a pet or a person. But with people, that's so easy in our culture because that goes into the funerals or memorial services type things. This is where I love children because children just are not contaminated and they're not worried about what people are going to think. And so kids will just outright say, well, when are we having, you know, the funeral for Rascal or things like that? Of course we're having one, you know, I mean, we've all heard of the family gathering around the toilet for the fish funeral. And so that's where children just, they're doing it right. And if we're smart adults, we would listen to them more. And so there does need to be an element of memorialization or ritual for our pets. And that looks different for so many different people and families. I know that in our community, there's a place where they do kind of an annual service because, or maybe more than annual, but where they do the communal breading and things like that. But you also can do something within your own family. I talked with a family, probably about a year or so ago. They had very young children. Their beloved puppy dog had died. And of course, the kids were talking about the puppy every day. It was tearing mom and dad's hearts out because they were devastated because that puppy was their first child before these two humans were born. And we talked about what is something you can do as a family. And they were a little unsure. They kind of, I think, probably thought I was a little nuts in the beginning, like, you want us to do an activity? And we talked through kind of their family. They spend a lot of time outside. The dog loved outside. So we talked about doing a stepping stone as a family. So they created a stepping stone and they put it in this part of their yard. And now I probably see or hear from this family, maybe once every month or so. And they still tell me how meaningful that is, how the kids like to play over there, or, they'll give a nod or a wave to their puppy. And so what they've done in that family is that memorialization was helpful to mom and dad and the children because everyone was hurting in different ways. But they also taught their children huge lessons about grief. That when you die, you just don't go poof in the air and you're forgotten, that life matters and individuals matter. And so I think thinking through, again, what's right for your family in terms of a ritual. Another family I know took the collar and had it framed with a little nose print, and it's in a little shadow box on a shelf in their den, and that's important to them. And so it doesn't have to be a huge, don't have to invite 50 people and we don't have to get the minister. It doesn't have to be huge like that, but we need to have rituals and opportunities for memorialization.
I think that if a friend loses a pet, sending them some flowers is a lovely start.
Yes.
Someone gifted me an art print from a picture that is proudly displayed in my bedroom, and her nose print and tail, I keep meaning to take that to get it framed properly, like a tassel.
Yes.
So, but like preserving those things, there are footprints all over my house.
And now there's so many options with just our world and how creative people are. There's different websites where you can have the pet put on a t-shirt or a keychain or in a little mug or something. And so there's just things like that to do, I think, are just really a nice way to say to somebody that I see your grief and your pet was part of your family.
And there are some really cool options that don't scream, this is a memorial to my pet, that can be worn every day.
Yes.
I have a necklace that has a little tiny gemstone in it, but if you hold it up to the light to your eye, you can see a picture in it.
Yes.
There are companies that have like little lockets almost that you can put ashes in, or you can have the ashes incorporated into some glass and made into a pendant. Yes. There's some really lovely ways that aren't like, a giant paw print necklace.
Right.
Although I would proudly wear a nose print.
That's right.
Yeah.
And again, that just comes back to, our basics of grief. Grief is real, and we do grieve. Whether you want to or not, you will grieve because you love. And so finding ways to acknowledge and to remember. And again, it doesn't have to be something that is proclaimed to everyone. People don't have to know. And we're here telling you that it's not crazy or wrong. It is an expression of grief, which is an expression of love. Yeah. Let's talk about other pets grieving, because people don't think about that. I've seen it firsthand. I had 2 little Shih Tzus that grew up together. And when the first one died, the second one was very lost. And we actually lost her within a year after him. I mean, they were close in age anyway. But we had to do a lot of extra stuff to kind of help her. And we had lost a person right before that. So there had been a lot of loss in our family.
Yeah. Pets really depend on routine. And a death, whether it is a person or an animal, disrupts that routine. And I think ultimately it depends on how bonded the animal was to that person or their pet. If they are leading parallel lives and they share a roof, but kind of sleep on opposite sides of the bed, it may be less drastic. But just giving them extra attention, making sure that we're not overlooking other medical issues, because I hear a lot of times that people come in and in the middle of the night and tell me, well, we lost a dog a month ago and we thought that this was her just grieving. We really shouldn't see physical signs of grief for longer than a few days.
Right.
If it persists beyond that, I mean, it might still be grief, but definitely do your due diligence and get that checked out to make sure it's not something far more serious.
We've had just working with people who maybe have had a spouse die will bring up their dog, and how they're seeing that. So we know that can happen with a person, but also with another pet. It's, again, they're sharing a roof, they're sharing a routine, they're sharing a family. Yeah. And so we're going to see that impact. Let's talk about coping, because we know we talk about this a lot on this podcast. We couldn't do this, those of us that do this as for staff and volunteers, if we didn't see healing and coping. And we do see it. It's different for everyone. It happens in different ways. I think with pet loss, one of the first things that can help you with coping is to acknowledge that your grief is real and to find your people who
can share
also
it.
support that. Yeah. So what do you see with people who are coping, or what helps them cope with pet loss?
I think coping, a lot of my circle is a lot of veterinarians and veterinary technicians. So it's very easy in my world to talk about how we're feeling.
Yeah.
Talking to family and friends. There are grief support groups and hotlines. The University of Tennessee actually has a grief counseling service. LSU and Colorado State also have services available to the public. So distance. Lap of Love, which is operational in our area. It's an in-home euthanasia service. They also have a grief counseling service. So they have grief support groups. And one of our local crematoriums, Dixie Memorial, also provides a monthly pet loss support group and has for a very long time. So those are, I think, some excellent resources to talk to people who are in the same situation you are. They've lost a pet. They are feeling grief, but maybe don't know where to go to talk about it with people who are going to understand. And those are some great ways to talk through your feelings.
Those are so important and needed resources. There's Facebook and Instagram groups as well where you can join, and just, again, support. We need support when we're grieving. We need to see that other people are feeling similar things, that something's not wrong with us.
No.
And we're telling you that on this podcast, that our pets matter and our pets are a part of our family, and it changes us. We grieve. We literally grieve because of that relationship and of love. Let's talk about things that are kind of important to remember when you are grieving a pet. One thing that I hear a lot is maybe when they come home from, if their pet was euthanized, or just coming home, day 2 or so after, is that it's a different type of silence.
It is. And it's silence. It's a change in your routine, because maybe you're not filling up that bowl. Maybe a pet needed a lot of medications and you have to dispose of the medications safely and put those things away. There's some cleanup that has to happen. You're going to change your space. If there was a crate or a bowl or a bed, maybe that's not needed anymore. And so there are a lot of things that have to happen. And really the only advice I would have is just to do it in your own time. Don't rush it. Don't try to erase their presence too quickly, because that hurts more.
Yeah. And it is, we were talking about how, some cats, they show it in a different way, but most of the time your pets are like, you're home. And so it's really hard to come home and you're not greeted like that. And all of a sudden you're like, oh, who loves me? Am I loved? I've heard that from so many people just because it's that lack of presence. And then you said the stuff, you have to decide what to do with the stuff, and different people do different things. I know people will donate things to different animal shelters, but again, like you said, it's not rushing. I know people who've kept food bowls, and kind of turned them into a neat little thing in a garden or somewhere else in the house. And again, that's part of that importance of memorialization and finding ways to just like you would hang on to things that linked you to a human. It's important to keep things that link you to that pet as well. And so again, taking your time so that you make choices that feel right to you. We talked about not ranking grief. It should not be done. It should not be done. And individual love, it matters, and individual grief matters. And yes, things are different and whatever, but there's no need to rank them. And so I think that's important too. Like you were saying, how people will apologize for crying. I hear people like, well, I'm sorry I'm talking about this because it was just my cat. No. Let's drop the apologizing for our love.
Normalize having feelings, man. Big ones, small ones, all of them. Yeah.
I think too, something to keep in mind is that the death of a pet can trigger previous losses and previous griefs.
So much.
Yeah.
A lot of clients tell me, well, this was my late husband's dog, or my child depends on this animal. This is their service pet.
Yes.
Their service animal. This is more than a pet to us. There are a lot of other things tangled up in the loss of a pet because they are more to us than just pets.
Yes.
And that is a whole other layer of grief. People make different choices. They might let a pet live a little longer trying to get, their child home from college to say one last goodbye. Or, I'm greedy for time. There's no time with your pet that is ever sufficient.
Exactly.
So,
yes. That goes to what I was saying when, with my two examples, when after my father died and we had a dog die, it just was so heavy and so intense. And I was trying to save. That's why I went and by myself when I was having to put her down was I didn't want anyone else to have to feel more sadness and pain. And because we were all feeling so much sadness and pain.
That is some straight up firstborn daughter behavior,
It
ma'am.
is. And then with my niece, my brother had died and then his dog. And I remember being so mad, just mad at him, mad at the universe, mad at the dog. Could everybody just not have done this on a different timetable? And so it really can trigger so many other feelings or emotions and so again, just like with normal grief we talk about on this podcast, that sadness, it can be other feelings, it can trigger a lot of anger and things like that. We've talked a lot about children. I think something too we need to talk about is going back to adults who are grieving. We mentioned it at the beginning, but sometimes people will get a pet when all of a sudden they have maybe an empty nest or, their spouse has died and they're looking for companionship. And then these are things to remember too. If that pet then dies, the losses that can trigger, the extra loneliness that they're dealing with.
It certainly can. Grief is a complex beast, and a little wave from the past will come up and smack you out of nowhere.
And so again, when you're people in your bubble, people in your world, when you hear that they've had a pet die, these are things to keep in mind. Is it just the two of them that live in that house? How different that might be for him now. What is something that I can do just as a friend, in terms of reaching out and support. So another question we get a lot is, when do we get another pet?
Oh, as always, the answer is it depends.
That's right. It depends. Now, what I've also seen with that and have said myself, because my heartbreak was so bad just a couple of years ago when we had to let our little Coco go, I was like, that's it. No more. I think I lectured everyone. We will never have another pet. It's too hard. It's too much, says the grief counselor. But here I am now with Buddy, the dog, who we love and adore, and we are so glad we have. But it took time to get my heart to open back up to that.
I think that a lot of people have a knee-jerk reaction, and I'm told frequently, I will never get another dog.
That's right.
I can't do this again. And the fact is that If you can't, you can't.
Mm-hmm.
But you probably just need time.
Yeah.
So if you're animal people, you're animal people.
That's right.
And it doesn't feel right once your heart kind of recovers from the crushing loss of a beloved pet. It doesn't feel quite right to be without them.
Yeah.
So there's no right timeline for that. There's no wrong one. But when your heart is ready, your pet will appear.
Yeah.
It's the cat and dog distribution system.
That's
really.
right. That's right. And we usually just tell people, again, to watch for confusing messages with children, because we can't replace grandpa with a new grandpa. So we can't replace, Coco with a new Coco. And so just sort of talking through that. And also, as adults and grownups, it is hard for us to see children hurting. And so there is sometimes a knee-jerk reaction with people of like, oh my gosh, the children have been wailing for 4 nights in their beds, and everything is disrupted at home because everyone is so sad. Let's just go get a new one this weekend so we can stop this. So I think we have to watch our messaging there. If you listen to this podcast, you know that grief is real, grief is big, grief is better shared, and that grief needs its space. And while it's not a bad thing to get another pet eventually, we don't want it to be kind of the magic wand to make the grief stop.
Or to kind of imply that pets are replaceable.
Right. Good point.
Each pet is special in their own unique way, and immediately replacing them maybe suggests that they're disposable.
Yeah.
That's maybe not a message that we want to convey.
We hope that we've covered some things here in this podcast to help those who are grieving a pet, grieving that 4-legged family member. We hope we've kind of talked through some things that maybe we can do better or different with children. I was even thinking, just as we were sitting here, I had a turtle that lived in my grandmother's backyard, and I came home from school one day and there was just a shell. And my family told me that turtles outgrow their shells. And I believed it for a long time. And then I remember just one day being like, turtles don't outgrow their shells. Wait a minute. And I think it was, like I was doing my work of becoming a grief professional. And I was like, well, maybe this is why I'm in this career, because I was lied to about our pets. So it's just so important that we acknowledge pet loss and that we're honest, and that, we're the adults kind of model that behavior. It's hard because I have seen pet loss bring down the biggest and strongest of men.
Yeah. Yeah.
And so it's a lot about normalizing emotions, normalizing relationships, and helping people learn how to do that.
Yeah. And being okay with sitting with your feelings for a little while.
Yeah.
Yeah. They are very valid. Pets are wonderful and important.
They are. We see Buddy at work now, and we see our pet therapy dogs and all that they do. And people who come in for counseling always talk about the comfort of their pets. And so they are more than just a fill-in-the-blank dog or cat. They are a family member. Yes. So I think as we're wrapping up, we also want our listeners just to know that we're talking about grief. This is grief. So all the other episodes of this podcast where we've talked about coping strategies, or we've gone into different reactions of grief, the 5 ways we grieve, that all applies here as well. Grief is grief is grief. And today we were talking about our pets, and so grateful to Dr. Amy for being here to talk with us. But all of those other coping strategies or ways of expression, those other episodes apply here as well. So take a look at the other podcasts that we have. You may see something that triggers kind of how you're coping here with this loss of a pet. Maybe it's the emotional responses or how to talk to a child. So check out those other episodes and see how they might be able to help you at this time as well. So again, Amy, thank you so much for being here. You are a gift to the Baptist Centers for Good Grief. You have given so much of your time over the years to our grief camps, and you continue by helping with our groups. And you are just one of those faithful volunteers of ours that we know we can call upon. I've also brought my four-legged babies to you, and I have been the maniac in the room that you had to come in and console. So over the years, I've seen you in so many different just aspects of life, and I'm grateful to know you. I'm grateful to have you as a volunteer, and I'm grateful for your friendship. So thank you.
Camp has given me a lot and has helped me professionally because I can give owners good answers to their questions from what you've taught me and what I've learned through volunteering. So thank you.
Thanks for being here. Grief does heal. Let me say that again. Grief does heal. But like we've said, grief demands attention and care. It also needs support and patience. Remember that your grief is a reflection of your love. You are not alone. The world is full of many grievers like you. You can learn more about us at www.baptistgriefcenters.org. You can check out our YouTube channel, Baptist Centers for Good Grief. You can check out our podcast wherever you get your podcast. Also, know that you can reach out and let us know if there's a topic that you're interested in learning more about. You're welcome to email me at angela.kelly@bmhcc.org. That's angela.kelly@bmhcc.org. And remember, grief is real, big, better shared. We'll talk soon.